Today I'm showing you 12 easy oil pastel techniques. Hi, I'm Syndia. If you like oil pastels, subscribe and hit the bell because there will be more. Color blocking. There are two ways to color block. The first way is to build the pigment gradually and lightly. To do this, I usually use the oil pastel stick on its side and I try not to saturate the paper. This is most useful in cases where you want to create more depth in your drawing and also more realism by layering multiple shades. An example of this would be a field of tall grass. The second way to color block is to saturate the paper, a big area of paper, to get a very vivid and solid color. And I usually do this when I know I won't need to layer more than 2 or 3 colors. I saturate large areas when I work in a more abstract or expressive way or for solid backgrounds. Blending. To blend multiple colors together, you can use your fingers, you can use a rag, or if you want a more detailed work and blending, you can use a folded paper towel, use a corner of it. But my very favorite tool for blending is a blending stump. It comes in different sizes and I use it for large areas and for details as well. To clean my blending stumps, I use sandpaper and I just rub off the pigment on it. Layering. This simply means to put different colors on top of each other. You can go dark on light, but you might want to test it on a separate piece of paper before because sometimes dark on light gets a little bit blotchy and harder to blend. But this really depends on the brand of oil pastel, the specific pigment you're using. Some dark on light work perfectly well. You can also go light on top of dark, which is my preferred method. In my experience, when I put a lighter shade on top of a dark shade, there isn't that blotchiness or patchiness that happens. For some reason, it usually blends better. Another technique is lightening, as in to lighten colors. I usually use white. I love using white on top of most shades. I think it gives a very creamy and smooth finish. My favorite white is Syndia because it's very creamy and it blends very easily. The lightening technique is perfect when you want to create very nice pinks or baby blue. Darkening. I use a darkening technique when I want to mute a specific shade, especially for objects that are farther in my composition. For a landscape, perhaps, let's say there's mountains in the background, I may want to use a little bit of black on whatever color I'm using it very sparingly and blending it to that color with a blending stump or with my finger to create a more muted shade. By the way, stick till the end because I'm saving my favorite technique for last. Gradient. To create a nice gradient, all you have to do is take 2 colors, whatever colors you want, you put one at one end, one at the other, and you fade them gently into each other. You can of course use any color and fade it to white. Very useful for skies and landscapes, for example, as well as any color and fade it to black. One technique that I use very often is stippling. Stippling is fun and it's really easy. Basically, all you have to do is put a bunch of little dots everywhere on your section to give a specific texture. You can use dots and short lines, and it's always good to use multiple shades to create depth and more realism and a more interesting texture. I very often use this technique to create leaves when I draw trees, and it's perfect if you love impressionism. Scribbling. Scribbling is another fun one. It's kind of the sister technique to this previous one, the stippling technique. This one is a little bit more random and erratic in a way. All you have to do is create a bunch of squiggly lines randomly to have a more energetic and vivid texture and create some movement and interesting contrast in your composition. You can also use it in a more conservative way to paint clouds, rolling hills, tree barks, and so many other textures. Side note, for this demo, I'm using the Gallery Oil Pastel set by Mongyo. It's my very favorite set. I made a full review of it. I will link it for you to watch it after this. Up next, Sgraffito. This is when you use a pointy tool, any tool, to scratch away some pigment within your drawing. It creates a very interesting texture. It can be used to paint some feathers, some fur, hair, tall grass. It's the perfect technique when you need a very precise line work in a specific area, or you can also give some kind of stylistic effect to your drawing. I use Sgraffito a lot. I like it. Etching. Etching is kind of like Sgraffito, but it's doing it backwards. You use your pointy tool before applying the pigment, so you engrave the paper with whatever design you want, and afterwards you use oil pastel to put on top of it, and it reveals whatever you engraved. Once again, this technique is very good for line work, hair, feathers, fur, tall grass, but it's also a very cool way to be creative and maybe add a quote within your drawing or to sign your work. You can also sign your work with Sgraffito. That's how I do it. We're almost done, almost at the end. My favorite technique is coming up soon. But first, let me talk to you about underpainting. This is very useful when you know you want to layer a bunch of different colors on top of each other. You can actually use acrylic paint as an underpainting as your first layer or a specific section of your drawing, or to tone the paper. If you don't want to use a white background, you could create a nice underpainting with acrylic paint, keeping in mind that it's better to have a thinner coat, a thin, even coat. Once it's fully dry, you can add oil pastel as you wish. Underpainting is useful when you work in a large format, or if you don't have a specific shade. Let's say you want to draw or paint a meadow, but you don't have a specific shade of green. You can create your shade of green with acrylic paint and then use whatever oil pastel green you have in your collection to create more contrast within your composition. But remember this, you can draw with oil pastel on top of acrylic paint, but you cannot paint on top of oil pastel. Here is my favorite oil pastel technique, diluting. You can use oil pastels just like paint with a paintbrush. There's many options to do this. You can use oils made for oil paint, like linseed oil or walnut oil. Some people even use baby oil. It works perfectly fine for studies, but baby oil is a little different, as in it's a non-drying oil, as opposed to the other ones that are specifically made for painting, which will harden and create a film over time. And baby oil is not archival, but it's still very good for practice. You can also use different mediums and solvents made for oil paints like Galkid and Gamsol, and there's a bunch of other ones. All of those products do pretty much the same thing. They liquefy your oil pastels, making it very spreadable with a paintbrush on your surface. You can create smooth gradients this way, a little bit more transparencies. The thing to remember though is that most of these products are kind of toxic, so you have to use them in a well-ventilated place and use the very smallest amount possible, especially if you work on paper, because it could break up the fibers of the paper and then you would get like a balling effect of the paper. But overall, it gives a beautiful painterly effect. Now you know 12 oil pastel techniques, but if you want to know everything about oil pastels in 5 minutes, watch this next.
For me, I'm in love with you.